There is something else that's been going on in the news lately, and it's sort of relevant to Lebanon. And this is, of course, the conflict between Israel and Iran and the intervention of the United States, followed by the tub-thumping attempt to impose a ceasefire on both of these sides. I'm curious for two aspects of this. What do you think, for a start, this means for Donald Trump and the MAGA idea of extracting the United States from more international intervention, seeing as it would appear Netanyahu played a blinder in being able to suck the United States into that conflict back again. And the other is, of course, we have a ceasefire now between these two. How long is that going to last? Weeks, days, months? What's the optimistic outlook there?
I think Trump has performed very differently and in many ways very cleverly. And it's very easy to underestimate Trump. I was at a conversation at the IEA party last night, and very senior member of the board, Trump, very good at populist gestures. And a lad there said, "Well, do you really think that just populist gestures get you elected twice as a United States president? There is something more serious there." And what, of course, he did was Trump is the master of gesture politics. What he does, he flies in those great, wonderful planes that look as though they come absolutely out of science fiction, which of course they do. They sail from America across the oceans. They drop these inconceivable bombs, and then, utterly uninjured, they sail away again. How very different from the interventions in Iraq and Afghanistan. This is clinical. It's distant, it's dramatic. You see something instantly. And this, I think, is the mark of Trump. He understands in a way which is, I think, is Roman. These are like the gestures of a Roman emperor in the great box in the Hippodrome in Constantinople. That mere gesture, or the Colosseum in Rome. That mere gesture changes things. And that is what he's so brilliantly good at. Now, again, how far do these gestures turn into anything real? I
Yeah.
think what he tends to do is to break deadlocks. That the world that we've been familiar with, the world of the so-called rules-based international order, is one that is just rather like the politics of Britain, is one that's tied itself in knots with legalism. We have problem after problem after problem, which just becomes absolutely intractable. Interestingly enough, almost instantly, once the Ukraine didn't fall as Putin expected it to be, it became intractable. Similarly, Israel and the Arab world have been intractable since 1945, 1948. What needs to happen, it seems to me, in the Middle East is that we recognize, and this again is straying into very deep and dangerous territory, but I think it needs to be said, what happened in the Middle East in the immediate aftermath of the Second World War was comparable to the gigantic movements of population and frontiers in Eastern Europe at the end of the Second War. I mean, what again we've forgotten, why has there been an astonishing degree of stability in the frontiers of Europe? It was that in the wake of the collapse of Nazi Germany, the relentless advance, permitted, of course, by the decision of the Western Allies, of Stalin, right across the great Northern European plain, you drive out the scattered German populations that had reached far into Poland, into what is now Lithuania, into what is now the Ukraine, and millions, literally, we don't know the numbers, 3, 4, 5 million Germans driven out in the most unspeakable conditions of torment, and women raped and so on, and frontiers moving 400 in places 400 miles to the west. It happened. It worked because it was accepted. In other words, a war can only end with a victory, but also the acceptance of defeat by those defeated. And there has been this absolute refusal of the Arab world to accept that defeat. And the problem is very simple. We have connived at that through the terrible machinery of the United Nations, the terrible machinery of the United Nations Refugee Organization, which is now clear, is penetrated from top to bottom by what amounts to Arab nationalism. And until that problem is fundamentally addressed, in other words, all paid for by us, all paid for by the West, this absurdity of the situation. And it may be that the drama of these two extraordinary figures, of Trump on the one hand and Netanyahu. I mean, I regard Netanyahu as within a whisker of being a statesman of the stature of Bismarck. In other words, he is making a country deliberately through war. It's something we have not seen in our own lifetimes, precisely, of course, because in Europe, the frontiers have been frozen. But the very reluctance of the Arab world to do the sensible thing and to accept defeat has given him this astonishing scope. I find myself, I am aware of some of the horrors that he's inflicted. I'm aware of the charges of corruption, but one's filled with dazzled imagination. I mean, just admiration of the man. It's quite extraordinary. And again the screams of genocide or whatever, preposterous as they are, but they're a kind of tribute to this man. And also to our own complete, Benedict, incapacity of dealing with them.
Yes.
What is so fascinating, you look at you look at the politicians of Western Europe, you look at their stunned amazement at Netanyahu, their stunned amazement at Trump, because they are politicians who operate on this tiny Lilliputian scale, bound by rules, terrified of law. They look at what people like Trump, people like Netanyahu, they're like our great politicians of the 18th and 19th centuries, or the politicians of Rome. And we are these little dwarfs, sort of scuttling between their legs. I always think that the real measure of the decline of Britain is that David Lammy sits at the desk of Palmerston. You know, the thought of the shrinkage of a country.
I mean, it's a fascinating topic, the sort of the reemergence of the great man in history, just at the very moment
And the
that
great power.
yeah, at the very moment that the West has decided, "Do you know what, we're just going to throw the rule book out of the window. We don't believe in that sort of, time-honored, time-tested idea of politics anymore. It's all to do with rules, and we just hope that everybody else sticks to them. We really hope that they."
It's so good. And that's exactly what Starmer is. Starmer said he hates politics. And he thinks that if you play by the rules, so including absurd rules that he's invented, everything will be all right. But whereas, of course, in politics, there's that wonderful, wonderful phrase in Shakespeare. There's a tide in the affairs of men, which being taken at the flood leads to fortune or whatever. And people like Netanyahu, people like Trump understand that. And you look at the sheer feebleness, the shameful feebleness of our politicians in Western Europe, Canada. Though again, Carney made a decent shot. He captured a tide which really was everything that he disbelieved in. Nationalism, national identity. This ultimate globalist suddenly turning into a tub thumping flag wave was one thing. Even when the flag waved is I don't think it is a fig leaf, is it? But it looks very much like a fig leaf of Canada. It's supposed to be a maple leaf. It could just as well be a fig leaf.